Welcome to the Munn Avenue Muse podcast, brought to you by Munn, M-U-N-N, avenuepress.com. And it's my pleasure and a delight to have Don Weiss, who recently published the book, Disease Detectives, which is a true life kind of mystery book that appears on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and you can get it today if you like. Don has a really interesting background. He started out, he was a chemist, went to medical school, practiced as a pediatrician in New York City and in the Midwest. And then after 7 years of that, decided to go into public health. He was even one of the epidemiologists involved in investigating the famous 2001 anthrax letter attack, and many others, which he talks about in his book. So, Don, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Charlie. Pleasure.
So let's start off by, let me ask you, what motivated you to get into public health in the first place?
Yeah, so in medical school, you take a class called biostatistics and epidemiology. And I was fortunate to have a professor. His name was Don Weiss. He was a very well-known infectious disease physician. And he just made it interesting. You know, I always liked math and science, and it was a way of dealing with health problems rather than one patient at a time in groups. So that was always appealing to me. I kept that in the back of my mind. After I was practicing pediatrics for about 7 or so years, I went back to school, got a master's in public health with a focus on epidemiology, and then moved into public health.
Were you living in New York at the time, or did you move to New York to get involved with the public health
Yeah, so
department?
I did my training, my pediatric training in New York at the Montefiore Albert Einstein system. And I worked in pediatrics there, homeless health, for a number of years. And then I took a job in St. Louis for 7 years. I was working in the underserved areas of the city. And that's where I got my master's in public health. They had a program that allowed me to continue to work full time as well as get the degree. Then I worked briefly at the health department in St. Louis, but I always wanted to come back to New York. That's my home. That's where I was born. So I
Yeah.
just kept looking for jobs, and eventually I was fortunate enough to get hired among with the disease detectives.
And how long were you there? It was quite a while, right?
Yeah, it was a little over 20 years, 22 years there, 23 total with the health department, but 22 with the disease detectives.
Having read your book, you were involved in many, many investigations. Can you share with us one or two of the more interesting ones that you what was the problem and how you solved it?
Sure. So it was an interesting, 2 decades. I think, I look back on, because I did a lot of history looking back at New York City, those 2 decades probably had the most interesting and challenging infectious disease outbreaks of any in recent, maybe the last century. I'll talk about two, one that's in the book and one that's not. The one that's in the book happened in 2017. We got a call from a hospitalist who was taking care of a patient who was really sick, had a disease that affected his lungs, his livers, and his kidneys. And those three organs together triggered in his mind a tropical disease called leptospirosis. Now, leptospirosis doesn't really occur in New York City, not in humans. And so he was puzzled at what was going on there, so he called to notify us. The clue is the fact that the individual worked at a vivero. What a vivero is a live animal market, and there's about 60 or 70 in New York City. And there's, live animals, and leptospirosis is a zoonotic disease, meaning that it's transmitted from animals to humans. So that was a huge clue. And then there was another clue that he threw out there, in talking with the family. They said, oh, there's another person there who got sick before their loved one, and that person died. So we knew where the vivero was, but all we had was this possible first name. They weren't even sure the first name of this other individual. And when we called the Vivero, you can imagine this is a business in which, everybody's running around. There's not a lot of extra employees. You're lucky if you catch someone to answer the phone. So they weren't really able to help us much, other than telling us that yes, there was a person there that stopped working, and yes, they heard the person had died, and they thought his name was, I'll just make up a name, for confidentiality. They thought his name was Lou, but they thought he died of a broken heart. And I said, broken heart? Oh, what do you mean by that? He was supposed to get married, and his fiancee broke it off. So with that information, all we had, there's several things that we could check. So I went to the office of the chief medical examiner and said, do you have any deaths in someone in the Bronx? So, if someone dies and it's not through natural causes, they investigate at least to find out if there's enough information to take the case or reject the case. So I had them digging. Then I called all the hospitals, in the area. I knew approximately where it was. And by combining those two bits of information, we did find an individual who matched the age of the person that we were looking at, who did die around the same time period. And the hospital didn't know what he died of. He came in really sick into the ED and died within a few hours. Fortunately, the hospital had saved some blood samples, and we were able to retrieve those and get them down to Atlanta at the CDC laboratory where they tested. And it turned out he too had leptospirosis.
Huh.
And then there was a third case that happened not far from there, a few blocks away, and a person was just cleaning up a basement apartment unrelated to the vivero. So lepto is a disease that is common among rats, and that particular area of the Bronx was known as a rat reservoir.
Wow. Wow. That's so was that a possible contagion, or is that a fairly limited thing in terms of transmissibility?
Yeah, that's a good question. Something that we always, think about with our infectious disease, whether or not it's transmissible person to person or just from the environment or from a vector like a rat to a person. A lepto is primarily, not person to person. You can get it from contaminated water. And in this situation, we think it was because it's excreted from the rats in their urine. If you're not careful about cleaning that up, if somehow you aerosolize it, so the Vivera used a high pressure hose to wash down the facility after each night, that probably aerosolized some of the virus, and that's how they got it.
Interesting. Yeah, and as I listened to you describe what you did, the the label or title of detective is so appropriate because if you are a fan of Law and Order, and you follow it, yeah, Don, you were like the detectives there. You're following clues. You're in effect knocking on doors, right? Uh,
Sometimes, yes, yeah.
you hit your fair share of dead ends.
Hmm.
And then it's a puzzle. And if you get enough pieces, you can put it together. Yeah.
It's funny
Uh,
you should say that. So there's a friend who's at the university here, and I see him in the fitness center all the time, and he's reading the book. And he came up to me a couple of days ago, and his job is he's now a judge, but he spent, I don't know, 10 or 15 years working in the district attorney's office. And he came up to me and said, "You know what? Your job's a lot like a detective." I said, "Yeah, you're right about that."
Yeah, and then and in the case in this case, the crime is a disease, not a murder necessarily, but it could certainly lead to death in many cases, for sure.
Well, there is one story in the book that's both. That was a story about an unfortunate child who ended up dying, a young child, 4 years old. And we did a lot of work. Again, I worked with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, and we determined that he died of thallium poisoning. And the only way you die of thallium poisoning now is maybe if you accidentally ingest some really old rat poison, because that ingredient's been banned, or you were poisoned. And that's the determination that this poor child was poisoned.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so tell us about that anthrax case, the 2001 anthrax case. If people are old enough to remember, that was shortly after 9/11. We had several anthrax scares, and it felt like it was a terrorist thing going on connected to 9/11. So,
When 9/11 hit, we immediately put into place some extra surveillance systems because we were worried that because we knew this was an Al Qaeda attack, that they might also try to target the city since we were in a scramble mode with biologic weapons. And we were looking for the most serious types of illnesses. Anthrax causes a pneumonia that is pretty serious, and people die from that. So we set up a system to try to detect that. It also causes other syndromes such as gastrointestinal anthrax and cutaneous or skin anthrax. And so that's what started cropping up. And it took us a while to figure it out because, if you have an ulcer on your finger, people wouldn't jump to think of anthrax as the first diagnosis. But, there was a photo editor down in Florida who was diagnosed with inhalation anthrax. And once that happened, we started to look back at these skin cases and say, well, maybe we ought to get them tested. And, it turned out that there was a total of 22 cases in the US. I think 11 were inhalational and 11 were skin. We had a bunch in New York. They were all they were either postal workers or somehow attached to the media. People who open, envelopes for, media personalities. And then the last two cases, which were the most puzzling, just happened with to ordinary individual citizens that had no connection to it. So one was a woman in New York City who worked in a hospital stockroom. Unfortunately, she had inhalational anthrax and passed away. And the other was a 93-year-old retiree in suburban Connecticut. And
Wow.
what the best that, this was just not our investigation, but this was, multiple state, the CDC, the FBI, they were all working on this. The best we could put together is that these envelopes that were mailed, believed to be mailed from Princeton, that had anthrax spores in them, the envelopes are porous, so these spores are very small, so they can leak out the ends or the corners. And what's thought is that as it passed through these sorting machines in the post office, which squeezes the envelopes, a lot of that powder came out and contaminated the machines, so that letters that came after them picked up spores on the outside. And
Ah,
so that's the
interesting.
best. We weren't able to prove it for the New York case because none of her mail tested positive. But for the Connecticut case, they were able to go back to the post office, which processed that letter, and they found positives there. None of the letter, I mean, she threw out her mail, so there was nothing really much there to test. So they didn't find anything in her home. But it went back to the post office, and they were able to find spores there.
Wow.
Um, and it's just, we didn't think a single spore could cause disease, but we don't really know how many can. But in these two scenarios, it was probably likely there weren't a lot of spores that they inhaled.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and there's like several other cases in the book. You also live through and work through the COVID outbreak of a few years ago, which I'm sure kept you guys pretty busy for a while. But I know in the beginning with COVID, they were trying to track cases, and then it just became so pervasive. I did read this week you were written up in the New York Post with an article about some thoughts on COVID too, but I don't think we'll go into that now. But I would recommend that if you're interested in this subject, and Don writes extremely well, go to Amazon.com and look for Disease Detectives by Don Weiss. So, Don, you live this career, but not everybody writes a book. What inspired you to write a book? And this was a major effort to document and write a good story about these various events and things you participated in. How'd that come about?
When I was in St. Louis and I got my first public health job at the city health department there, it was a small health department, I think maybe 300, 350 employees, and very few actually had secondary training in public health. And it was a crazy place to work. I call it the gang that couldn't heal straight. Um, chest x-rays weren't being read for tuberculosis. Checks, the state would give us checks for some of the things that we would do. Someone would put them in a drawer and never cash them. It was a crazy, dysfunctional place to work. And it reminded me a lot of the Joseph Heller book, Catch 22, how dysfunctional things are. And I just knew right then, this is a story I had to write. Um, so I ended up writing that. That's a novel. I fictionalized that. But I always had this idea that these were interesting stories. And when I got to New York, I just started taking good notes all along as we had outbreaks. And certainly there were plenty of them, and each one more interesting in a different way. And I think the main purpose of writing the book was to highlight the work that my colleagues do. Public health is not something people think about in their daily lives. And with all the criticism and firing of civil service and government workers, I think the book comes out at a timely time to help people understand what their tax money is doing, especially on the city and local level. And that without this, for an example, we do, or the health department does, 50 or so foodborne investigations a year. And each one they do is preventing future cases because they're going into that restaurant and they're finding out, well, where are these mistakes? And they make them go through the process. Well, how did you make that hamburger from start to finish? If they're cross-contaminating the lettuce for the salad with the raw meat, or a pot doesn't have the right temperature, or there's, rat and insect infestation. So they're all things that we correct, and then the inspectors go back and make sure they've adhered to the recommendations that were made, and now you've prevented illnesses down the road. Public health is all about trying to prevent illness and promote health.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I have in my business background, I spent a lot of time learning and training other people on quality process and business, and a lot of it was focused on prevention. And you don't see prevention as much as the fireman who puts out the fire. You don't see the person that prevents the fire, right? And they're not generally labeled as the heroes, right? Because you don't see it. It didn't happen. But it didn't happen because dedicated people like you and the people that you worked with um, worked hard not to make it happen. And that's a lot of what goes on in public health and many other public health local services that are
Mm,
dedicated to preventing serious things from happening. So, yeah, I think your book is very timely. It's at a time where the chainsaw has been taken to a number of things that might be very important to our health and our future.
yes, I
Um,
agree there.
yeah. So, what was the writing process like for you? How long were you working on this book, and what was the challenge of writing this book?
Well, as I mentioned, I've written other books. The other four were all novels. So this was the first nonfiction book that I had written. I had written chapters for books that were nonfiction, so I sort of built upon that. And I told you that I had taken really copious notes throughout all these outbreaks. So it was probably around February last year, I sat down with all these notes and started to put them together, did extra research, and it went pretty quickly. What was different about this than about writing a novel? A novel, you have to keep the same thread throughout chapter to chapter. So each time you open your laptop and start again, you got to go back and read, well, what did I just do? What's going to happen with each of these characters? And each chapter here was separate. I was done, boom, started afresh on a new chapter. And some of them I had really good notes, and it didn't really take much to put it together. I think the process was a lot different. It was a lot smoother than my other publishing experiences, and I think it went faster. It
That's because
had,
you worked with us. That's why.
yeah, I think that's probably it. I think that it had, more components to it. For instance, when you write a novel, for the most part, you don't need a legal review. But certainly when you're writing something nonfiction, you want to make sure that a lawyer has looked it over. So, but
Right.
yeah, it went pretty quick.
And you have, there's a lot going on in this book because you have extensive appendices and an index, um, and I think it helps too that you had experience writing fiction because each chapter, in a way, is a short story, and you're telling a story, these stories, and you know how to tell stories that are interesting to read because it's not a textbook,
Yeah.
and it could be a dry textbook, and it's not. It's almost like true crime. I mean, it's like really interesting stories. It happens that in this case, the culprit is the disease, right?
I
Um,
appreciate you saying that. I think good writers write stories that they would want to read.
Absolutely right. I think that's the best stories. It brings up an interesting question, and I've certainly read about this and talked to authors about it. There's some authors that research, okay, what's selling now? Uh, so you had this like the Gone Girl phenomenon where you had the unreliable narrator who turned out to be a not so nice person. And then there was this rush of novels. Well, usually people who do that, A, you can tell by reading it, their heart isn't in it. They're doing it for maybe the money, or they think they're going to get rich doing this. And usually by the time it goes through the traditional publishing cycle, which takes 2 years, the trend is gone and we're on to other stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm a big believer in, and many of our authors like you are the same, is write something you care about and means something to you, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. If you have particular knowledge of the subject, that adds another level of authenticity to the story you're writing. Um, and then you see what happens. I mean, if you write a good story, other people will be interested. But if it comes from the heart and it's something you care about, I think that's the better place to start, for sure. Yeah. So, what's your goal for this book? What would you like to see happen now? It's only out a couple of weeks. So, um, what would you like? I think on our very first conversation, I always ask authors, I asked you, what's your goal? What do you want to see happen?
Well, it'd be nice to get on a bestseller list, but I don't have any illusions about that. My goal, as I think I stated a little earlier, is that I want to bring to the public attention, whoever's interested in learning, about the work that my colleagues do. And even though not everyone who works for government works in public health, I think there's similarities across this. Just as you said, these are the people working behind the scenes. In a large part, they're working to prevent things from happening, working on traffic situations, on sanitation. There's all sorts of parts of the public sector where you don't know what these people are doing, and you don't necessarily see the benefit because something didn't happen.
Right.
So that's really, and you mentioned in the index, right after that's a list of all the people that I work with as these detectives, giving a shout out to them.
And it was a
So
long
yeah,
list. You must have had 100 people in that list.
yeah. So at our biggest size, no, more than 100, probably the two or 300, the Bureau, when I started there, was only 25 to 30 people. It was really small. And then with each outbreak that happened, we got money to hire people so that, when I left, there was probably about 100 people that worked there.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah,
Yeah.
it is a long list.
And I will mention, though, that last week you were an Amazon #1 bestseller in at least three categories. So
Okay.
that was pretty hot stuff. And a #1 new release for the first couple of weeks the book came out, too. So,
That
uh,
sounds good.
yeah. So I highly recommend Don's book. And as I say, it's available on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com. Don spells his last name Weiss. So it'll be easy to find. It's a fairly unique title. So what's next for you, Don? Are you thinking about writing anything else? Do you have a new project in mind?
Yeah, I have several that I'm thinking about. So I only included 16 outbreaks in this, and there were many, many more. So I have enough material to probably at least write one or two sequels. So I'm thinking about that. And then, I might go back to fiction writing. I have a couple of story ideas. Everyone does, I think. You get this great idea, and then you say, well, would it be enough for a book? How was I going to, translate this idea into a book? And some of them I think might. So that's probably what I'm going to do. And then I'm still busy coaching. We're in recruiting season now, trying to get new players here to the
Oh,
university to play on our women's basketball team.
yes, you coach women's basketball. And at what university is that?
It's a Moravian University located in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, good for you. I'm
Yeah,
sure
I
that's a
tried.
lot of fun. Different.
Yeah,
That's very different than what your vocation was.
yeah.
Well, Don, it's interesting because it reminds me of, well, I think it's great that even though your book just came out, you're thinking about the next book. That's what real writers do. You're always thinking of the next project. But how do you make the decision as to what to write? So you're thinking about, oh, it should be maybe a sequel to Disease Detectives or maybe a novel. And the writing is very different, as we talked about. With nonfiction, you have a lot of material or fact-based material to work with. With fiction, you have to come up with it. Although, if you're basing it on your experience, you have a lot of material in that sense, but you do have to invent the characters and the situations. And many writers are full of ideas like you. Others struggle to come up with an idea, but it's great when you have a lot of ideas. So how do you choose what I'm going to do next? Because it's going to take the better part of a year to write a good book. You're going to spend a lot of time on it. You want to spend time on what matters to you most. And I thought one of the most interesting things I heard from a favorite author of mine, David Morrell, and you probably have never heard of David Morrell. Have you, Don? No,
No, I
but
might have seen a
but
book of his, but the name doesn't sound familiar.
right, it's amazing. No one knows his name, but his most iconic character everyone knows because he was the creator of Rambo.
Uh,
And everybody knows Rambo. In fact,
right,
Rambo
sure.
appeared in the New York Times crossword puzzle 2 days ago. It's everywhere. It's almost a figure of speech, like he was a real Rambo. But what David Morrell does, because he's written, I don't know, 30 books. I've read most of them, and they're really a great read. The movies are fine, but the books are better. Uh, he wants to make the best decision about what he's going to write next. So he writes himself a letter
Hmm.
and he says, "Dear David, I have this idea for a new book and it has such and such characters that do this and the plot revolves around that. And here's what the main character desires and here's the obstacles that he or she is encountering." Um, and he writes this letter. And the letter is 20 to 25 pages long. When he finishes the letter, then he reads the letter and he decides, do I like this enough to spend a year writing this book? And sometimes the best decision you can make is to say no, right? No, all right, I'll write another letter with my other idea. But if he decides to write the book, he's already got a 20 to 25 page outline. I thought this was such a great idea that when I wrote my second book, Not So Done, I did the same thing. Only I got through about 15 pages and I was so excited about the plot of the book. I put down the letter and just started writing. I wasn't going to wait. But I mentioned that method to you because, in a way, what you're doing is you're putting yourself at a distance from it as almost like a third party telling you this story, and you are evaluating it as to, hey, I can get excited and passionate enough about this to spend a year working on
So you didn't mail the letters because that would actually give you a little more distance. You'd have to wait till the letter came.
it.
This
No, I
is
didn't want
similar
to get
to
any anthrax in the letter. I just,
this is similar to what, I've often advised people. They say, "Well, I can't make a decision. It's either one thing or the other. I don't know what to do." I said, "Well, do this. Flip a coin. Assign A to heads and decision B to tails. Flip a coin and just try to gauge what your feeling is as soon as you see where it lands. So if it lands on heads and you're disappointed, well, then you know your decision should be B. If it lands on heads and you go, I'm so happy it landed, and then, because that way you're sort of tapping into that inner decision that maybe your brain isn't quite figuring out just yet.
Right. That's similar to writing the letter. It's sort of
Yeah.
putting the decision at a distance and then bringing it back into how do I really feel about this? Um, yeah, very good. Good advice. Don, thank you so much for taking the time to share your journey with us. And I would love to see sequels to disease detectives. All your reviews so far have been 5-star reviews, so people are liking it. And once they read book one, they may want to read book two and three. Um, to my authors out there in the audience, we call that read through, which is why a series can be so effective. I've written a 4-book series, the Not So Dead series, and when a new book comes out, people go back and read book one or book two or three because
Right.
they want to catch up. So there's some benefit in building on your audience, your readership by offering sequels.
Okay,
So
that's good to know.
so this has been totally fascinating, Don, and it was fun working with you on this project, and hopefully when book two comes around, we can work on that one too. And if you have a book in mind or a history of writing and would like to talk about publishing a book, do reach out to me at munavenuepress.com and subscribe to munavenuemuse.com, where it's available on Substack, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And until next time, thank you for listening and watching.
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me and having me on the podcast.
My pleasure.